let's say, the environment. And there are two functions here also, which are more about the internal organization of the system. Yeah. Then there are functions which make more use of instrumental kind of rationality, and others that do not use this kind of rationality. These two sort of grouping categories then create this 2x2 matrix. And Agile simply comes from the four first letters here: adaptation, goal attainment, integration, and Latin pattern maintenance. So a lot of Parsonian vocabulary here. Let us briefly go through an example of how to apply this scheme to the entire society. This is the example here I used. So a society has to somehow survive, right? It has to have an economy, that it has to have sort of an instrumental relationship to means of persistence. It has to organize basically goods and commodity, has to organize goods and transform them into commodities in order to persist. So in a way, it has to adapt to the outer environment, and the way this is done is in the economic system. For Parsons, every system also has to develop what he calls generalized mediums of interchange. And Parsons thinks about systems as being organized in a way as communicative systems. So systems communicate, and the, let's say, generalized medium of sort of communication, of exchange in the economic system, to give an example here, is money. So the way that I communicate to you in sort of the economy is that I offer you to pay a certain price. I don't have to tell you much more. In a differentiated subsystem of the economy, it's enough that I communicate to you via prices. So this is a little bit the idea of what a generalized medium here of exchange means. So yeah, for Parsons, this is still sort of a medium of exchange, properly speaking. For Niklas Luhmann, who extends Parsons into a theory of communication, this is more of a communicative act. The goal then of the subsystem is simply commodity production. Okay, let's move on to the G, the goal attainment. In a society, the political system is in charge of setting the goals, the political agenda. This is done through exchanges that are communicated through power. The medium of exchange here is power. If politicians don't have the majority, then they can't get goals. So they have to organize the majorities, at least in the democratic system. And the output then of this system are political goals. Okay, the third subsystem here of a social system or a society is integration, the I. So here you can think about any kind of institutions that make up civil society, social capital, so clubs, religion, associations, the media, where sort of more non-formal influence is the medium of exchange, and the output are any kind of civic society institutions. Last but not least, latent pattern maintenance, the L. Very cryptic term to describe what kind of cultural institutions a society develops in order to maintain itself, to basically pass stability on to the next generation. And here any kind of education institutions fulfill this role in Parsons' view, but also families. So any kind of institution also that produces or communicates values. Yeah? So the medium of exchange, Parsons says, is value commitment. Yeah. Yeah, so this is in just one example, the application of the agile scheme on entire societies, but you can also easily explain this or apply this and explain institutions such as schools, right? Where you analyze a school through its economic exchanges with the environment, right? The Federal Ministry of Education again, donors, philanthropists, the parents' organizations, etc., where the school also has a certain school board that makes decisions. It's internally integrated through certain classrooms and clubs, etc. There's a functional differentiation of different roles. And last but not least, there's a certain spirit in the school. There are certain values. There's a charter it attains to that it's committed to, etc. So any kind of institution, including also personal systems, any kind of system can be analyzed through this scheme, and you may also try. It has also been further developed as sort of a cultural system governing this entire social system. Then you just sort of reverse the order of the letters. And as I said, Parsons also added an evolutionary theory at the end of his theoretical works in order to describe not only how society functions, how institutions function, but also how they change over time. Okay, so this was Talcott Parsons in the 1950s, a young German civil servant who worked basically as a lawyer in the federal ministry. Niklas Luhmann took the opportunity to get postgraduate studies at Harvard with Talcott Parsons in 1960, then it was. And within a couple of years, Luhmann was so fascinated by sociology and system theory in the Parsonian sense that he did his PhD and wrote his second PhD habilitation thesis in almost less than 2 years and became a professor of sociology in Bielefeld in 69, which is still the center of system theory sociology up to the current day. And I should also mention that there was a current of, let's say, more conservatively minded sociologists in German academia at the time. And Niklas Luhmann was rather part of this current and was a little bit the main opponent also of many participants of the student rebellion participants in the 1960s. So Luhmann, in a way, extends then Parsons' theory into a theory of general social differentiation. And one of the main contributions is probably to bring in more modern complexity and cybernetic theories into the system theory. His works can be divided into the more earlier, let's say the pre-system kind of works, mostly published here in German, Sociological Enlightenment, for instance, which I can really recommend because the early Luhmann did not yet develop a jargon of his own and is much easier to read than the later one, which has a glossary, a vocabulary of a couple of hundred terms which are unique to Luhmann, and has produced just a huge jargon which is a very easy indicator, by the way, to identify Lumanians or Luhmann-inspired scholars up to the current day. Then in his works, there was a huge turn towards a more system-like theories in his book Social Systems, which then he gradually developed, describing one subsystem after the next, and ending then in the German publication of 1998 with a 2-volume Theory of Society translated into English as well, which is a very neat summary, actually, of most of his works. He was a prolific writer with a huge input, reading input, but also a huge output already during his lifetime. And much of his input, actually, just a little fun fact here, he wrote down by means of excerpts on these little note sheets, which he organized in just a huge box of note sheets, in German the Zettelkasten, which contains more than 90,000 papers and which nowadays becomes digitized in a project in Bielefeld. Luhmann explains how he organizes all of this himself here in a video, if you're interested. And if you're interested in Luhmann studies in the future, this Zettelkasten becomes more and more digitized. And yeah, it's probably a treasure for future Luhmann studies. After the system turn of Luhmann's in '84, it was also very important for him to discover this concept of autopoiesis, which I already mentioned. So this idea of decentrally self-organizing systems, which he incorporated from the Chilean biologist Roberto Maturana. Okay, I will briefly present some of the main features now of Luhmann's theory. First of all, one distinct background of Luhmann's that Parsons does not necessarily share is the Husserlian, so Edmund Husserl's phenomenology, which also inspired a very particularly German current of thought, that is philosophical anthropology. And I will elaborate much more on this particular current in our lecture on phenomenology. Just for the time being, Husserlian phenomenology is a very constructivist a kind of philosophy, in the sense that everything that is sort of perceived through a subject, in Husserl's term, is also what makes a reality. And Luhmann draws very much on this basic insight of the constructivist Edmund Husserl, a philosopher of the earlier 20th century and the main teacher also of Martin Heidegger. A second motivation also for Luhmann was that in the post-Second World War young sociology in Germany, there was a certain divide between a very, let's say, empirically minded, untheoretical Cologne school of sociology and the very normatively minded Frankfurt School of Sociology, which Luhmann uses also to deride as the old European kind of sociology. And Luhmann saw, in a way, a gap for, let's say, a non-normative theoretical kind of sociology, which he pursued during his life. And by way of theory options, also Luhmann occupies a very special place. Remember from the earliest lectures that there's a certain distinction in developing theories between ideal language and ordinary language kind of theories. And this is a distinction which exists in philosophy, but also